Greetings, everyone, to our Swedenborgian community online book discussion. Today we have quite the wonderful, magnificent book, in my opinion, The Universe and I by Reverend Dr. George Dole, subtitle Where Science and Spirituality Meet, which, as I'm sure you'll agree, is a topic we can all get excited about in the Swedenborgian community. Well, thank you all for joining us today. This is a book discussion. We haven't done one of these under my, uh, you know, ministry, you could say, yet. So we'll just see how it goes, and hopefully we have a lot of input from the chat seat. If you feel like calling in, it is not too late. You can find the number to call in at the top of the chat seat, near wherever you're watching this, hopefully, on our website, Swedenborgiancommunity.org as well. If you're listening to it live, a lot of our podcast listeners won't get the chance. But thank you all for joining us. Hello, people in the chat. Elvon, nice to meet you. Ward, greetings. Hope you're doing well. Alyssa, you too. And Mark, and the rest of you joining us. So I thought, just to as an introduction, as we get settled, think about some of the things you want to talk about that kind of stuck with you. But I thought I'd read the back of the book, not the whole thing, but some of the quotes, just so that our listeners can get a feel for what this book is about. This is from George Greenstein, the Sidney Dillon Professor of Astronomy Emeritus at Amherst College. And he says of this book, in this engaging book, Dole elucidates structural parallels between Swedenborg's writings and the nature of scientific thought. Particularly intriguing are the similarities that he points out between Swedenborg's discussion of emergence and physicists' concern with the development of structure. Dole finds fascinating resonances between the spiritual and material worlds, moving us to a more nuanced conception of causality. And then the other quote is from Ian Thompson, who is also a Swedenborgian, a physicist at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, actually. And Dr. Thompson says, the Reverend Dr. George Dole's book makes important strides toward reconciling modern science with the principles of theism as elucidated by Emanuel Swedenborg. On the way, Dole exposes a whole host of obstacles that scientific thinkers impose upon themselves, and he ultimately illustrates the common ground between their work and his own. Dole's efforts here go to show that we need more thinkers such as himself, who can help make that ground a large enough place for us to live, move, and have our being. All right, I hope that served as an okay introduction. Oh, hey, Elvon, thanks for saying hi back. I appreciate that. And to the rest of you, too. So, what do you all think of this book so far? Those of you in the chat, or if anyone calls in. I really love this book. I've already read it once, and I actually got to chat with some people at camp about it, one of the Swedenborgian camps that they hold for a week in the summer. And it's quite the journey. You know, at first I was a little confused. You know, you jump into a physics book, and it can't help but kind of fly over your head, at least for me. But I think like reading it again and having, especially having kind of the bigger picture and having the discussion really helped me get into it. And even when I read it, especially after the first chapter or two, I really got into it. It's quite a beautiful book, and it really, as this quote said, elucidated my thinking in physics and in the world around me and how divinity connects. So, as you all decide what to share about your opinions so far, I know it wasn't assigned reading, but the preface actually has a lot of good information. So if you'll turn with me, if you have the book, to the first page of the preface, 9 in Roman numerals. I thought it was cool that George Dole mentions that he wrote this book out of a lifelong interest in the interface between science and religion. You know, often in religious conversations, we kind of dismiss science. A lot of different dogmatic approaches to religion tend to dismiss science. I hope that we can lean away from that habit. I know that in Swedenborgian circles that doesn't tend to be the case, but you never know. And I think grappling with what science helps us to uncover, what we're learning through science, and even the approach of science is actually a really healthy way to look at things rationally and try to really get to the heart of what's going on in this universe. And I don't think you should take anything just because someone said so or for tradition's sake. And so it's cool that the Dr. George Dole has been interested in this his whole life. George Dole is a minister in the Swedenborgian denomination that we're a part of. In his mid to late 80s, he is quite the speaker, the writer. If you read Swedenborg translations, you've probably read George Dole's translations. And it looks like we have some quotes starting in the chat. So, hey Albert, how are you doing? And so it's cool also, and as he mentions in this first page of the preface, how he wants to be in dialogue with Stephen Hawking, specifically his reading of A Brief History of Time. And I find that throughout the book, so it's a good point to make it here at the beginning. And it's interesting, some of the ideas that Hawking brings up, that George Dole quotes from Hawking, that have kind of this heavier import than just taking things from a reductionist view or anything like that. And I think we'll get into that, because that's essentially what this book is about. It's about how these deeper things, these kind of transcendent things, show up even in science and from scientific perspectives. And George makes this interesting point about human experience and how, as he says, reliance on the controlled experiment rules out consideration of that whole realm of learning that goes by the name of experience. Human experience is made up of anecdotes, and the only way science can control anecdotes is to collect as many as possible and calculate probabilities. And that's true. If you ever read a published scientific study on experiences, it just asks people what words they'd use to describe it, which is subjective, and then kind of aggregates those based on maybe what they describe or the words themselves, and then create probability distributions from that. And yet the feelings themselves aren't subject to scientific method within a human being, and yet that's often the most important thing in our lives, is how we feel. So I find that interesting that he brings it up. And Albert shares a citation. He says it's at 4% on Kindle. If you can find it that way, that's great, Albert. A research on the subject of human well-being consistently shows that 6 factors weigh most heavily: marriage, social relationships, employment, perceived health, religion, and the quality of government. All but the 4th have to do directly with community, with interpersonal relationships. And yet even the 4th, probably, if I'm counting them right, perhaps. It's interesting, those studies that show how community can help uplift our health, being in connection with other people, and that we can feel much happier, less depressed in community. And so perhaps our perceived health especially could improve. And of course, I think quality of government definitely has to do with community, and I don't think he's making a commentary on that, but I do think it's interesting how often the conversation breaks down at politics, and yet, politics rule everything around us, right? So I think it's a healthy conversation when we can approach it healthily. Thank you, Albert. That's great. And what is it exactly, Albert, that speaks to you from that quote? Do anyone else have any thoughts on that quote as well? So George Dole says his title was actually originally prompted by Hawking's statement that, quote, if we do discover a complete theory, it should in time be understandable in broad principle by everyone. Really, understandable by everyone? That's amazing. Then we shall all, philosophers, scientists, and just ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of the question of why it is that we in the universe exist. And then the emphasis we in the universe is George Dole's emphasis. So I guess that leads us to our title, The Universe and I. So yeah, that's interesting that, and I've heard this quoted before, Hawking brings up this idea that a complete theory must be understandable by all. And George Dole brings this up pretty repeatedly in these first two chapters. How, okay, what does it mean to have a theory that's understandable by all and also explains all things? How do you have a theory that explains the smallest concepts and also, the higher things in human life itself? And I think that's a really amazing question. Yeah, and Mark brings up a really good point, actually. So, go. Sorry, my dog's digging a hole. So the the footnotes of the book are actually really important. And as George Dole mentions, he puts his kind of witty quotations and riffs in these footnotes. And so, yeah, you have to read them to get the whole feel for it. And maybe we'll touch on a few of these. Also, I think it's kind of funny how he approached those footnotes. Half the pages, a good portion of the pages are like half footnotes, so it's like, if you're used to skipping them, don't do it. You'll probably notice why. And if his witty stuff is in the footnotes, of course, we're going to read it, right? Okay, so I also thought it was cool in the preface that he brings up this idea that a lot of physicists or, just people have, not all, that things tend to fall into messiness often. But I think also even those of us who think that can relate this idea that even if things fall into chaos to some degree, we sure have gone a long way in this universe towards beautiful structures on all these multifaceted levels. And that's kind of what George Dole says. He says, things have been processing so steadily, it seems, and so beautifully, at least in this universe, that we can't ignore this cascading effect of structure and connection and how it leads to more and more beautiful things. And so lastly in the preface, and then we'll get into the introduction, he kind of outlines the entire book. So he says, first I'll take a closer look at some ground common to science and religion, at what we don't know and why we don't know it. Then he says later, I will then discuss what we can assume that we know, offering a very stingy selection of observations on the history of the universe as I understand it to be currently constructed. And I will mention he is not a creationist, at least in the way we think of it. The story that leads from a primal, undifferentiated messiness to the present vast and intricate cosmos in which we find ourselves. In fact, Swedenborg wasn't a creationist in that strict term either. He viewed those early stories of the Bible symbolically. So Swedenborgians tend to have an easier time digesting Big Bang theory and evolution, and you may find yourself in that camp as well. And then I'll mention this at the end, the next two chapters on emergence, and also the evidence of such a non-physical reality that he doesn't think could be dismissed as the fifth chapter, or the fourth chapter. Fifth chapter? Well, we'll be covering them eventually. So, any thoughts on the preface and George Dole in general? I know a lot of you probably have had connection with George Dole in the past. Maybe Elbert, have you met George Dole at a convention? Maybe he hasn't been to many recently, given his age. But you know, he is a Swedenborgian minister, so he's been around. His name is on a lot of stuff. I actually had him for a Swedenborgian exegesis class on essentially the entire Bible. You know, he didn't limit himself to what Swedenborg wrote exegesis on, which is kind of a verse by verse deep dive into Scripture. Swedenborg writes a verse by verse exegesis on Genesis, Exodus, and Revelation, but no further than that. Although he mentions a lot of other Scripture, George Dole kind of approaches it as like, okay, I think this whole book has kind of a story arc, as in the Bible, and so how do we delve into that? Oh, so you haven't met George? He's a really sweet guy, and maybe one day we can all meet at camp. And the camp I'm thinking of is Freiburg in Maine, Freiburg New Church Assembly. It's beautiful out there, and he invites everyone out to his lake cabin to just visit on the outing day. So if we can all meet there one summer, we could go crash at George's and jump in the lake, and maybe have a live in person service. No, my dog. So the introduction. I thought this was a somewhat hard to digest introduction at first, but upon repeat reading, I think it does a good job at laying out the book. So Hawking looks forward to a discussion of why we in the universe exist, in his book, A Brief History of Time, I believe. And George Dole kind of runs with that idea. Okay, so if Hawking thinks this is a good topic, George says, let's go into it. And he also spends a good amount of time at looking at, kind of what scientists say they think is a good topic, or what their book is about, and how much time they actually spend on it. So in a lot of these like scientific books, these scientists will mention, okay, there's something deeper going on, and then never really go into what this deeper thing is, and maybe even kind of contradict it later, saying that, okay, well, there can't be anything deeper going on. And that's when they're kind of expounding on certain details. So I find it kind of amazing that it's almost like the hook. Is this a deep thing? Yes, it is. It's really deep. Read about it. And then you read it, and it doesn't, it hardly touches on it at all. I thought that was an interesting highlight from George. And so why do you think the universe exists? Does anyone have kind of a preliminary idea of what it's about? It seems to me that George, at least in these first two chapters, is pointing to something, let's say, evolving, showing up. That there's this kind of relationship between divinity and creation, where creation in these limited spheres, finite aspects, represent parts of divinity or embodied by divinity, but kind of in a limited fashion in relationship to other limited things, to infinity in a way. And that the expression itself, the expressions are so dynamic and manifold that as they interact with each other, they build like these greater expressions that, lo and behold, lead to more diversity, the beauty of diversity. And then again, in relationship and community, lead to greater and greater diversity. And he says in this introduction, in this first chapter, that part of the thing that leads to this is this tension between like kind of being alone and being in community. And when we get to it, he uses different phrasing. So I'll let him explain it a little bit better. Yeah, I don't know if he's over 90, but he's definitely close to 90. Thanks, Paige. Yeah, and Elvon, Paige is mentioning how she's from Bryn Athyn. If you don't know this as a listener, Bryn Athyn is kind of the home to a lot of Swedenborgians, specifically our broader, more conservative branch, you could say. actually much more conservative in certain ways. A beautiful place, beautiful people, and it's nice that we have people there to visit sometimes. Yeah, and George has a really broad perspective. You're right, Paige. And he looks at the big picture. Yes. I'm going to repeat a lot of what you say in the chat seat today because I think as a book discussion, those listening on the podcast probably want to hear, what you all have to share. And oh, someone has called in. I'm sorry for missing that. Hello, who's this? Hi, it's been a few minutes since you called in, but I'm putting you on the spot. Are you still there with me? Or maybe you're just calling to listen. All right, well, if you feel like saying or jumping in, do it at any time. You're more than welcome to.
Oh, can you guys hear me? I was just listening.
Oh, hey.
Yeah,
oh, you can hear me. Okay. This is Marianne Fisher in Cincinnati.
Oh, hey, Marianne.
Hey, I thought that
you?
was Mr. Feckety's voice.
Oh, yeah?
I'm doing good,
Yeah, I'm not David Feckety. Is that who you're talking about?
That's who I thought your voice was. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, I love David. That's sweet of you.
As you can tell, I didn't pay too much attention. I just thought, oh, George Dole, science. Yeah, I'll listen.
Oh, awesome. Well, George is amazing, and so I'm glad that caught your attention.
Yeah. Now, who is this? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I am Reverend Corey.
Okay. Okay, gotcha. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry about that.
Corey Bradford.
I'll just go back to listening.
Okay, well, thank you for calling in and connecting.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. One of the greatest things about this online community is it's been around for so many years. You don't know necessarily who's hosting. Reverend Wilma, of course, was with us for 10 years. We miss her dearly. David Feckety's on. Actually, I play his music quite often, Reverend David. He's fantastic. Maybe I'll share one of his messages soon. Yeah. So thank you and welcome, Marianne. You're more than welcome to connect anytime, and the rest of you, if you want to call in, our phone number is 646-564-9571. Make a note of it if you're listening later, if you ever want to call in. Yeah. So Albert mentions the extraordinary figures that that George Dole references early on. Shakespeare, Buddha, Cleopatra, Muhammad, Jesus, Goethe, Socrates, Genghis Khan, Dalai Lama, Bach, Mother Teresa, Rembrandt, Napoleon da Vinci, or Hitler. And I think that's in reference, right, to where George Dole says all of these people have to understand this fundamental precept, and it also has to explain their actions and perspective. And so a lot of this book is really about moving away from this reductionist idea. And so George quotes Stuart Kauffman, who he says does pay attention to us, unlike a lot of his readings of different physicists. And he puts it like this: reductionism in its strongest form holds that all the rest of reality, beyond particles and their aggregates, from organisms to a couple in love on the banks of the Seine, is ultimately nothing but particles or strings in motion. It also holds that in the end, when the science is done, the explanations for higher order entities are to be found in lower order entities. Societies are to be explained by laws about people, they in turn by laws about organs, then about cells, then about biochemistry, chemistry, and finally physics and particle physics. And then George makes the note in the footnotes: it is at the level of quantum physics that the language of explanation becomes either mathematical or metaphorical. Yeah, and I think that's an important theme of this book, is moving away from reductionism that only looks at things almost like they originate from the laws themselves. Like, well, we know the laws, we know everything. And then often, as these laws become manifold, we actually find we don't know much at all. And then even when we look really, closer at each law, and maybe particle physics, for example. The more we learn, the less we realize we know, which is the beginning of wisdom, according to many philosophers, including Swedenborg. And so I think that's an interesting um, line of conversation in this book. And so this is also where George Dole in the introduction goes into Stephen Hawking's idea of this universal theory, this complete theory, and how it has to account for human being behavior. And I find it interesting that he doesn't necessarily, George Dole that is, doesn't necessarily pick on Stephen too much about this, but he does make the point that Stephen doesn't talk much about why humans do much, and maybe there's other books on that, even though he talks about why. And so the why that Stephen is looking for isn't the why of, okay, what's the purpose of creation, but maybe, like, how does everything start? What's, like, the fundamental nature of it? Which, if I'm phrasing it correctly, are kind of different questions. And George, I think, makes the point that a lot of physicists actually make in passing, that in a lot of ways, science and even, like, history itself starts with us in a way, because we're the ones choosing to do it, and it's always through our kind of appearance of truth, through our ability to digest what's going on around us. And so, and he quotes it at some point here, but some scientists make the point, okay, let's start with us and move backwards through time in terms of really finding a common thread. Because it's easy to get lost in the detail, in the formulae, the particle physics, when we only look at what's microscopic and never really look at how it's impacting human beings. And George makes the point that if we don't look at how it's impacting human beings, like, often when we get really deep into these physics, the more distant it feels, the less relevant to today. And actually, I think he quotes a physicist saying that. So maybe one of you all can help me find that. So is Elvon, I see that they're mentioning photos with you. Are you a photographer? Have you contributed photos in the past? That's really cool. Yeah, Elver makes the point. Which of those figures he knows in that list and which he doesn't know well is a humbling experience. Mine too. Yeah, I think often in life, I think that humbling experience is probably the most potent one, as I'm sure George would say. So, okay, moving on from that, he also connects with Hawking and, I don't know how to say this name, Ladenau, another physicist, on something that he finds significant. And I'm curious if you can share why this is significant. And he quotes them saying, in cosmology, one shouldn't follow the history of the universe from the bottom up, because that assumes there is a single history with a well-defined starting point and evolution. This is the quote that I mentioned. Instead, one should trace the histories from the top down, backward from the present time. Some histories will be more probable than others, and the sum will normally be dominated by a single history that starts with the creation of the universe and culminates in the state under consideration. But there will be different histories for different possible states of the universe at the present time. This leads to a radically different view of cosmology and the relation between cause and effect. The different histories don't have an independent existence, but depend on what is being measured. We create history by our observation rather than history creating us. Yeah, so, it's almost like a quote that I wouldn't expect from Hawking, but maybe it's because I haven't read much Hawking. But, he's saying here, at least in this moment, in this book, that we should look at history backwards, starting with human experience, human perspective. And I would say at least acknowledging it, because how else could you lean towards a more objective view of reality? Listing your context is really important. And that's where I'll go into some of George Dole's context, which he made the point of listing earlier in the footnotes. Besides having a BA from Yale and an MA from Oxford, he got his PhD from Harvard in a lot of religious stuff. It doesn't mention it here in the book, but he taught ancient languages. So I believe one of his foci were in those. And then he's also taught the Bible, Hebrew scripture, Testament of Christ, the Gospel, at a few different schools. It mentions the Swedenborg School of Religion in Newton, Massachusetts, but the Swedenborgian theological school, which has gone by 3 names in the last decade, he's taught at. He's taught at each of those versions. And the newest name is the Center for Swedenborgian Studies, and it's now in Berkeley, California. It's a really cool school. Connect with their website. Jim Lawrence, if you ever want to reach out to someone who can take your studies deeper, Reverend Dr. Jim Lawrence is a great connect. You can find him on that website as well. And so as I mentioned, he's taught one of my classes before, and I find him to really have this inclusive view, as Paige mentioned, that I hope is coming through in your reading of the book. And Albert brings up, he says, the problem with history is apparent in the word itself. Herstory is limited in history, and every minority describable is limited in the story called history. Yes. Well, often in history, we limit, not just in the word, but in every telling that I remember growing up, we kind of, you're right, we kind of stomp all over minorities and kind of the broader view of herstory when we connect with this topic. And that is really important, I think. Thank you for bringing that up. So Mark says he read the first chapters and it made little sense. Then he read again for this, but read the footnotes and it's completely different. Yeah, so if you're watching this, read the footnotes. It's kind of like the punchlines to the detail, I would say. And so, in dialogue with that quote from Hawking and Ladenow, I'll say, Dole points out this radically different view of the relationship between cause and effect that they allude to. And he says that it suggests a model in which the end is implicit in the beginning, the omega and the alpha, quote, which is, of course, characteristic of goal-oriented behavior, he says. And he says, I'm reminded of the first line of the Recordaire from Mozart's Requiem, Recordaire, and language I don't know how to speak. In English it says, remember, gentle Jesus, that I am a cause of your path. And he says proposing it on a cosmological scale is striking. And I think he's making a wonderful point here that Hawking and Ladenow are indicating that, okay, let's dialogue about this on a cosmological scale. And that they're asking really deep questions here. And where do we go from that? How do you approach a question or a theory like that? And so, as he winds down his introduction, heading into his book, he also makes a really striking connection between Hawking's, how should I put this, model-dependent realism, as Hawking would say, and the appearance of truth, as the Swedenborgian translations say, that Swedenborg was really into, and how similar they are. So I find this striking as well, and maybe you do too, that Hawking really focuses on something that I really love about from Swedenborgian thought, that everything that we think, of course, is a model from our perspective. So you lean into those models and realism, making sure that you put in dialogue rational thinking, and evidence-based science, you could say. A thoughtful, wise approach to understanding the universe, theology, your life, whether or not your decisions are healthy or not, whether you should lean into better practices, uh, even spiritual practice, even meditation, even seeing a counselor. These things should be based on, okay, does this seem to be healthy for people, and not kind of a knee-jerk reaction to something just because of tradition, maybe how you label yourself, your context, things that may or may not be um, really impactful in your life. In fact, often how we limit our own view of ourselves can limit what we um, do in our life in a way that can sometimes be hurtful to our health, or be hurtful to others' health. Maybe we think everyone born on the left side of the street goes to hell, for example, or that what have you, that women are created less, leading to words like history, um, etc. And really reviewing these things radically, and maybe often just usurping the things that are really dominating, even without uh, you know even without necessarily checking every fact and figure, just knowing that this is really unhealthy. That's a figure in itself. That is human experience. You've probably collected data on, okay, when we're bigoted as a human species, we're hurting people. Let's lean away from these bigoted tendencies, and we'll lean into the details as we go, but not in this kind of like argumentative, well, I need to know every detail about that before I am willing to make a change, because often that's just us digging a trench and being unwilling to be kind and uplifting to other people. And I find that that's a big theme here. And as he starts this dialogue on this subject, he points out that even though theology and science actually have a lot of common ground, there's this place where they differ often, which George Dole says has to do with free will. And he quotes a time-worn adage. He says, all reason argues against free will, and all experience argues for it. And then in his quips in the footnotes, he says, even the most determined predestinarians tend to hold themselves and others accountable for their behavior. And I think that's true. And I think often, we acknowledge free will in ways that we don't realize we do. And I think that's a fundamental element of creation, as George Dole is pointing out. And also he puts into dialogue with this theme of free will and, okay, science, religion, where can we meet? With Hawking and Ladinow making the point that we seek answers. We're looking for something deeper. We're not just doing this for no reason, but what is that reason? Why are we driven to this? Is it just to placate ourselves? I don't know if they ever mention that. Or is there something deeper in creation? Is creation itself leading to something? Is this emergent reality kind of an image of seeking, of developing and cascading creation of the beauty that is divinity, that is the universe? And they make the point that, quote, man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life and not a secondary rationalization of instinctual drive. As many books go, we have a lot of male pronouns here. I will not change all the quotes like I do with scripture, or at least English translations, so forgive me for that. And then George Dole wraps up this section of the book saying, he is most grateful to Kaufman for clearly and explicitly challenging the reductionism that has dominated Western science, at least since Galileo and Newton, but that leaves us in a meaningless world of facts devoid of values. And George says, this sounds like an invitation to my kind of conversation. And I think that gets at the heart of this book. And yet I think we're still kind of left wondering, okay, so what are you saying here? Where are you going with this? So let's see what we've said in the chat. Oh, Albert, yeah. Thanks for that quote. We're on the same page here. Thanks. Um, from Viktor Frankl, yes, that quote, man's search for meaning. Marx mentions time as a function of gravity. To experience time travel like Hawking wanted to either one has to die or get away from all gravitational fields. Yeah, I think it's interesting that we have this kind of soft but strong force, you could say, gravity, prevalent in all matter, even the matter we don't know much about, called dark matter, which is most of the universe, strangely enough. Um, and I find it interesting that gravity kind of pulls things together, that there's like a tendency, you could say, for connection. There's a tendency in matter for community, for coming together, and it leads to some really beautiful, interesting dynamism, connections. You know, I mentioned this in another talk, but this universe started off pretty plain, and yet here we are. The Big Bang, at least our theories and science behind it, tend to indicate that the particles at the beginning of what we call time, the beginning of time, were very much similar. And it wasn't until they started coming together that we had these more beautiful, um, complicated structures and relationship. And it wasn't even until the first giant suns exploded and supernovaed and all those things that we started having the heavier elements that make up a lot of what allows us to be human. So I find it kind of amazing that that is the cascade of the universe. Of course, if that weren't our universe, we wouldn't be here to talk about it, as many people point to. And yet, you know, we are here, and so that I think it still brings up some questions, even if, you know, it's kind of a self-fulfilling realm. And also, I think a lot of times when we mention that, we point to this idea of like infinite universes. A lot of physicists do that. That there might be infinite universes. We're in the perfect one. I find it interesting that that's a belief. You know, there's no real evidence for that. So it's one of the many beliefs that those of us who are into science have. Okay, so let's go into chapter 1. What we don't know. I know I don't know a lot, so forgive me. If you want to share your ideas and thoughts about this, it's still always open to call in or join our chatzy. We will be having our second one of these in 2 weeks, if that's okay with everyone. So we'll be doing chapters 2 and 3 in 2 weeks, which will be the 27th, I believe, September 27th, 2018. And if we want more time, we can do it the second week of October. So just message me and then watch your emails or the website, and you'll know for sure. But join us in 2 weeks, one way or the other. So he starts this chapter kind of laying the groundwork for this idea of what we don't know and how to approach it. And he points to Hawking and Ladenau again, saying that they take pains to reject the common assumption that things really are what they seem to be, as perceived through our senses. Rather, they write, we shall adopt an approach that we call model-dependent realism. It is based on the idea that our brains interpret the input from our sensory organs by making a model of the world. And as we mentioned before, this is kind of a running theme for Dole in this book and connecting it with Swedenborg. And then Dole mentions how this is not a new idea. Kant talks about this in his Critique of Pure Reason. And we know Kant was a Swedenborg reader, which is interesting. Although he called him kind of a mad genius. He called Swedenborg a mad genius. And which is understandable, let's be real. And he also says that, you know, this idea appears a lot in theology, actually. And a lot of a theological thought will point to the ultimate reality in God as utterly unknowable in any real, full sense. And then further, he talks about how Swedenborg steps into this conversation a few hundred years ago, and also talks about this appearance of truth that all of us are in, including spirits in heaven, which he considers to be angels, and that even for angels, he says, there is no way for any truth to be pure. It's only for divinity, it's only for the infinity of wisdom, the infinity of love, to have a full awareness of truth itself. And that truth is accepted if there's something good in it, or it leads to something good. And so I think we can relate that to our lives, especially when we tend to, I can be dogmatic about certain ideas maybe. I know in the history of thought, we've definitely grappled with this dogmatism that we've developed. I don't know, we use. In religion, often this is the case, we don't want to hear it if you're disagreeing with us, if you're across the street, if you're a different religion, if what have you, you're wrong. If you have the names wrong, you're entirely wrong. If you say things a certain way, if you don't have kind of this structure, then you're wrong. And I think remembering that our ideas are only an appearance of truth, and that they're really considered to be true and wise if they lead to truth in our living and help uplift, or goodness in our living, and help uplift goodness in other people's living. And Swedenborg makes the point that, God does not limit herself by gender, for one, but that genders are an expression of divinity, just like nature is an expression of divinity. And God is transcendent, more personhood, more personable than any of us, because we receive that from God, and that's the way it should be. And being willing to receive and see that in ourselves is a really healthy thing. Receive goodness, receive strength, and also uplift it in other people, see it in other people for what it is, not just as someone different than us, but in a way, someone very close to us in God, because we receive all our good things from the same source, divinity. And so Swedenborg talks about how model-dependent realism can be, or actually George Dole does, model-dependent realism can be really harsh when applied ruthlessly. And actually Swedenborg does talk about it, just not in those terms, how truth kind of devoid from love can really be harsh, really tear people down. And so it's not really truth in that state, it's being misused, at least from the perspective of divinity. And as Elbert uplifts, a critical question is posed by Hawking at the close of a brief history of time. Even if there is only one possible unified theory, it is just a set of rules and equations. What is it that breathes fire into the equation and makes a universe for them to describe? Where did it all come from? Yes, and that is that underlying goodness, that divinity that we are expressing as we cascade towards greater and greater health and relationship. Mark uplifts this idea, time is a function of gravity. Yeah, I mentioned this already. But I do want to mention, in relation to this quote, that time in our lives seems really important. And I think it is, in a way. We have this kind of linear trajectory. But often we grapple with the question of, okay, well, if God is omniscient outside of time, then, aren't these predetermined? Why study physics? Why get into religion? If it's all predetermined, what's the point? God could have just snapped their fingers and this would have happened the way that God saw it happening. And I think it goes back to this idea in this book that I think George Dole is bringing into tension between spirituality and science, that freedom is inherent and really important and hard to describe scientifically. But God gives us our freedom for a specific reason, for this emergent creation, for these things to have their own existence outside of the infinity intensity of divinity. And yet they're expressions of divinity because they can't help but be. God can't help but uplift these things. And health in all its guises, goodness, truth, wisdom in all its guises are expressions, forms of divinity that point to divinity, that are enlivened by God, by the higher power. And so, but putting that in relation to us, like how do we relate, being such a differentiated human being in time, subject to gravity, how do we relate to that infinity? And in a way, that's one of the underlying themes of this book, which we'll notice he mentions again and again, which is this tension between differentiation and the whole of infinity. Like we tend to move towards differentiation, but then we move towards holisticness, towards this greater health. And this is like this interesting thing that happens on every level of creation. And it's like a real beautiful strand, but it's hard to comprehend. It seems like a paradox that these things could be in relationship and connected in such deep ways. And what does that mean? Okay, so moving through chapter 1, if there's anything in this chapter that strikes you, you can point to maybe the first few words of a paragraph. I can probably find it. It's hard to type an entire paragraph. So if you point to a paragraph, kind of the general area of the book, I can find it and quote it. I know it can be tough doing this in Chatsy with if you want to share a quote or something. Unless you have Kindle like Elbert, then you can, I hope you can just paste it. So I find this an interesting thought, that in the Big Bang, we have this certain theme that we usually think about when we talk about it. So I'll read George Dole in describing it. Modeling the Big Bang as the cause of a closed universe could be regarded as the agnostics' version of deism, of the God who started everything running and then retired to let it run on its own. In which case, according to the second law of thermodynamics, it should be consistently running down. It is not. We seem instead to have an open universe, calling for a ceaseless supply of energy. This we might regard as the agnostic's version of theism, of the God who is omnipresent and continually active. And both are really important, I think. And I'll read this next paragraph too, because I think it's beautiful in its sentiment. In the latter model, the maintenance of creation is not simply the maintenance of something that has been created, but is the maintenance of creating, of the activity itself. According to Swedenborg, maintenance is constant creation, just as enduring is a constant coming into being. So the question is not simply where did it all come from, but also where does it all keep coming from? And I recommend you read from there if you haven't read it already on that subject. We'll touch on it again, but yeah, where does it all keep coming from? I know for some people, maybe even hearing that doesn't quite digest it. Okay, why does it have to come from anywhere, But I find it interesting that he points to the second law of thermodynamics, that if the Big Bang started with some type of energy buildup in a very small point, as most of us hear the Big Bang described, and it expanded tremendously and has been expanding and developing as it goes along, yeah, according to the second law of thermodynamics, it should be running down because energy dissipates, it gets caught up in different structures, at least. Maybe one of you can explain the second law better than I can. And yet it's not slowing down as we actually once thought in physics. It's continuing to expand and maybe speeding up. And that calls for a ceaseless supply of energy, this increasing expansion of space with matter in it. So I find that really food for thought. And then later on the next page, and he's going through Hawking and Ladenau again. He says the Stoics often describe or they say the Stoics often describe physical processes in legal terms and believe them to be in need of enforcement, even though the objects required to obey the laws were inanimate. If you think it is hard to get humans to follow traffic laws, imagine convincing an asteroid to move along an ellipse. Yeah, and then he talks about how, George Dole talks about how eventually Hawking and Ladinout talk about particles obeying laws. And so they kind of move from this why and this deeper questioning and how do these things develop in such a beautiful way that we can describe by laws, and eventually kind of turning to this language of, oh, these things obey laws. And I think often we fall into that. It's almost like, and I don't mean anything towards their spirit in this, in their description in this book, but often we kind of move towards this kind of, okay, these things should follow these laws. This is the law. Everything is descendant from the law, but actually, at least in physics especially, these laws describe what we see. They don't, the things we see don't come from those laws. We're putting notation, we're putting our interpretation of structure on them. And we try to make it beautiful and make sense and recreatable and all these things, but they're describing reality. It doesn't come from reality. And George Dole says this keeps happening. Time after time he reads statements about matter obeying the laws of physics, govern the behavior of particles, determine how things happen. So what is this all getting at? What do you all think? I'm going to turn back towards the chat see. And just take a moment to chat on here. Albert, you say, Cross marvels at the way beautiful and miraculous objects suddenly appear. You're quoting. From snowflakes on a cold winter morning to vibrant rainbows after a late afternoon summer shower. Yet no one but the most ardent fundamentalist would suggest that each and every such object is lovingly and painstakingly, and most importantly, purposefully created by a divine intelligence. Yeah, so what do you think about that quote, Albert? So I also find it kind of the culminating point on this laws and what's following what. I find it interesting that he says the laws are based on the events, or more cautiously, they are based on our observations of the events. If any event can be shown to contradict the law, no scientist in his right mind would say that the event must be brought into agreement with the law. And that's a good kind of question for our thinking. If we, if we do kind of fall into that trap of life from law in a sense, at least in physics, then, or creation from law, then how do we explain? Okay, but we change these laws all the time. We tend to we find ways that we're off in science quite a bit, which is kind of the beauty of it. And I find it kind of beautiful, this idea, and we'll wrap up with this and continue in the Chatsy for kind of a more Chatsy-oriented conversation. But this hard problem in physics around how subjective experience arises from neural computation. And that there's this real question in physics around how do we think, how do we have this awareness from these things that seem so chemistry-based, that seem so limited? And I think that's what this book ends up dialoguing. I think it's kind of a beautiful journey into scientific thought of today, physicists' thought of today, and really does hold them accountable for their language often, for their big ideas, and how they tend to walk away from it, as many of us do in living. We have the idea of, okay, this is what we're going for. We don't quite make it to the sun, but we do take steps forward. I think that's kind of the journey. In a way, that's what this book is about, this journey towards the sun. So join us in 2 weeks for more chat about this. And join us in our Chatsy for maybe a more nuanced communal talk or call anytime. Go forth knowing you're loved.